Please be seated. Good morning. Welcome to this morning service. It's good to always see all of you here for this Sunday morning adult English service. Last week we talked about Buddhism central concern, which is the resolution of difficulties that we experience as human beings. And that derives from the Four Noble Truths. Four Noble Truths, the first is that we experience difficulties. And it's not necessary, again, to be a Buddhist. If you have no difficulties, no need for Buddhism. And the resolution of difficulties can derive from many different life experiences. You don't have to be a Buddhist to begin to approach these difficulties. But to begin with, Buddhism describes that as human beings, we encounter difficulties in our lives, and we may be engaged in many different activities attempting to resolve those difficulties. But what Buddhism suggests is that these difficulties can be understood as arising from our inability to see things clearly, and that result in things like greed and anger and ignorance. We don't see things simply as they are. We see them through the lens of our what we expect and what we like and we don't like, our prejudices, our preferences. These all influence the way that we see the world. And because of our reliance on these views and perspectives, and not just views and perspectives, the way that we engage the world, that way that we approach the world results in difficulties, not just for ourselves, but for others. And that the resolution of these difficulties is to begin to see things clearly, to see things simply as they are, and to do that. The fourth of the Four Noble Truths is the Eightfold Path. So if you look at this basic structure, this core structure in Buddhism, it helps us to begin to look at what Buddhism is about. Often we think of, especially within an ethnic sangha like this, a sangha that grew out of a Japanese tradition. It has very deep roots in Japanese culture. And those cultural values influence our understanding of Buddhism. And that's why for longest time I've been trying to separate these two, Japanese culture from what Buddhism is talking about. And you can go back to stuff I've written 30 years ago, or more than 30 years ago. I've been talking about this for a long time. But when you go back, when we look at our cultural roots and the influences of our cultural roots, we can see that these are cultural values. It doesn't mean they don't align with what Buddhism is describing, but they're values that are characteristic of Japanese culture. And if we're able to separate, these two things, cultural values and what Buddhism is talking about, then we can begin to see more clearly what Buddhism has to offer. And we can bring it together again and still be fine. But unless we begin to separate this cultural values from what Buddhism is talking about, it's very difficult to see what Buddhism has to offer. When we simply combine these cultural values, and now we're having American values introduced into and flavoring the understanding of Buddhism. These values become if these values become the definition of Buddhism, again, something can be lost. What is Buddhism talking about? So when we describe the cultural values, things like gaman or endyo, we associate with Buddhist values within Japanese culture. And if we hold only these kinds of expressions to be what Buddhism is about, then it speaks only to the cultural values and not what the Dharma is talking about. The Dharma is not about cultural values. Okay? The Dharma is not about cultural values. It's not about how you might align yourselves with values that are found within a particular culture. Because that value in that culture, things like, gaman, to, how would you translate gaman? To endure. Endure for a positive outcome. And that enduring is itself positive. Or endyo, to restrain yourself. These values, although important contributions to Japanese culture, they are values that are not easily applied to other cultures, or they're not values that are valued necessarily in other cultures. And even if they were valued in other cultures, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a Buddhist value. Values like altruism, compassion, kindness, these are values that are recognized across cultures, across religious traditions. You find kindness in other religious traditions. And even without being religious, you can be an atheist or an agnostic and still value things like kindness and compassion. It's not something that defines what Buddhism is about. So, values, good and bad, are not what Buddhism is about. It's not what defines Buddhism. I go out on a limb here, but it's not about being good or bad. Because good and bad are values that do not define what Buddhism is about. I think the base value in Buddhism, cause no harm, and that derives from the first of the Four Noble Truths. We already experience difficulties. Don't do anything that would cause further difficulties. That's fundamental, and I think that's the base value in Buddhism. We have like the Eightfold Path, Six Paramitas, all of these kinds of instructions that cultivate values. But I think the fundamental value is cause no harm. That's what we bump up against. And again, it derives from the first of the Four Noble Truths. The first of the Four Noble Truths says we encounter difficulties, and that's what we're trying to resolve. We're trying to become freed of the difficulties. So don't do anything or refrain from doing things that would result in difficulties for ourselves and for others. And so we have many different kinds of practices that look into how we think about things, how we do things, how we feel about things, how we talk and say things. And so we look at our behavior that would reduce the amount of difficulty that would result in our behavior, result from our behavior. But it's not about good or bad, right or wrong. Buddhism is about the resolution of difficulties that we experience. So, understanding that what Buddhism intends to do is resolve difficulties. The solutions or the resolution may appear to be very contradictory when you go from one tradition to another tradition, or one culture to another culture, or one practice to another practice. But it doesn't matter what the practice is, or the culture, or the values that are being ascribed. It is whether or not it resolves the difficulties that we experience as human beings. So to just say, be good, doesn't really, may not actually resolve difficulties. Just to say you have to be good doesn't necessarily resolve difficulties. Because what is good? Right? What is good? Good is something that may be good in one culture or one segment of the population. Again, with this, the political crisis, or not crisis, it's not a crisis really. The political differences that exist within our tradition, within our country. One side says this is good, the other side says this is good, and there's no resolution. And this constant conflict we may see as being a bad thing. Right? It's all judgment. It's all deciding what's appropriate. It's all judgment. But that conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. It's the differences of opinion coming together, working out, and then trying to find a solution. And just because you have differences of opinion that engage in conversation doesn't necessarily mean that that's bad. You have people working towards, and that's what's important, right? Working towards a resolution, a solution to the problem. So differences in opinion, although they do exist, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. But whether or not, again, from a Buddhist perspective, and I think this is fundamental, does it resolve the difficulties that we experience? Does it resolve the difficulties that we experience? In Jodo Shinshu, what Shinran realized was that no matter how he approached the resolution of difficulties, it was always short of that resolution. No matter how much he applied himself, it was always short of that resolution. The simple stories of Shinran being on Hiezan for 20 years, studying, applying himself, doing all of that, eventually dissatisfied, coming down into Rokakudo. So he was, in his life, it expresses this dissatisfaction with what was traditionally the path to the resolution of difficulties. And dissatisfied, unable to approach the resolution through traditional practices. And what he arrived at was what Honen was talking about, that the resolution of difficulties was still possible, even if we recognize our own inability to do so. It was still possible through life itself moving toward a deepening understanding of our experience as human beings. If we're mindful, if we think about what we're experiencing, that mindfulness allows us to see not only my inability to experience a resolution of difficulties, but also to see how we are moving towards a deepening understanding. So if somebody dies, somebody important to us dies, our life is thrown into turmoil. We remain only in that turmoil, and we experience the suffering, dissatisfaction, grief, unhappiness. But there are things that are happening around us that can move us toward a resolution of that, not a doing away with that experience, not a setting aside or changing the death of an individual, a friend, a person that's important to us. But what's happening around us helps us to better understand my feelings, my thoughts, what I'm experiencing. And that opening up allows the suffering or the difficulties that we experience to begin to settle out. It doesn't remove what I am experiencing, but it transforms how I experience it. Right? It doesn't take away the death of someone close, but it transforms how I experience that. In I think it's in Shinran's writings, he says the more the ice and the more the water, the more the ice of our hard experience, the more the water of enlightenment, the hard ice of this narrow view of the world changes into the water of enlightenment. The harder we struggle with the experiences that we encounter, the opportunity to transform that into enlightenment increases. But it requires us to be mindful of what we are experiencing. So from a Buddhist perspective, again, these solutions to the difficulties that we experience, there are multiple approaches to resolving difficulties. Whether it's in a religious tradition, a secular tradition, no tradition at all, these are all approaches to resolution of difficulties. What Buddhism suggests is that because we don't see things clearly, our behavior results in difficulties. And it's to begin to see things simply as they are that allows us to begin to move towards a resolution of difficulties. And in Jodo Shinshu, seeing myself as an unenlightened being, caught up in the difficulties that I experience and the difficulties that result from my behavior, allows me to begin to see the connections that I share with the world around me. To see that my life is the result of others. That my life is not just my life, but is connected with the lives around me. That my life is sustained, nurtured. I'm able to experience things because of what surrounds me. Buddhism is not about good or bad or right or wrong. I think that's a distraction when we focus on that. It's also a distraction when we focus on enlightenment as being what Buddhism is about. I think when we look at that, we miss this other half. There's no reason to be a Buddhist if we don't see that its intent is to resolve the difficulties that we experience as human beings. That's what Buddhism is about. It's not about cultural values. It's not about good or bad, right or wrong. It's not about how to live your life. It's about the resolution of the difficulties that we experience. Sometimes we get so caught up in about right or wrong in our behavior. Last time I talked about problem solving. That problem solving is not just problem solving. That problem solving is a problem solving of the difficulties that are fundamental to our experience as human beings. Sometimes when we get caught up with the words. And in the Dharma school service, I talked about the golden chain, remembering all of these things. The next thing after remembering, you have to know its meaning. After its meaning, you need to apply, do it. When we look at enlightenment and values, we miss what Buddhism is about, which is the resolution of the difficulties that we encounter and experience in our lives. Being good is a matter of fact, just taken for granted. Who would just go out and do bad stuff? I mean, people do bad stuff, of course, but someone that is trying to engage in a life that has value and meaning would not be engaged in things that its society, our society, would identify as being harmful. And being good is, they say, atarimai, matter of fact. That's your behavior. That's what you should be doing anyway. Buddhism is about resolving the difficulties that we experience, that we cause and experience. How do we do that? In Jodo Shinshu, we understand the limitations of our skills and abilities, and yet at the same time, that life moves me toward a deepening understanding of what I experience as a human being. My response is Namo Amida Butsu. My response to that which moves me toward enlightenment is Namo Amida Butsu. In Jodo Shinshu, it is an expression of gratitude that I too am able to eventually resolve the difficulties that I experience and cause. Namo Amida Butsu. In Jodo Shinshu, understand, is an expression of gratitude and appreciation. Not a petition. It is not some formula that resolves the difficulties. It is my gratitude and appreciation for life itself, for infinite wisdom and compassion, for Amida, that moves me towards the resolution of difficulties that I encounter. Okay, so this is chapter 2. Last week was chapter 1. No, the week before. We don't often get this opportunity to kind of have consecutive services, to speak in consecutive services. It's not really consecutive, but the last time before Ohigan, I had an opportunity to speak. Today, Rinba Fujimoto is in Morgan Hill. The first Sunday of every month is Dharma School at Hoakai. Hoakai is the Japanese language group that meets there. And so there's briefly a Dharma message in Japanese. And so he goes and he speaks to the Hoakai as well as the Dharma School. So you get me for a second time in a row. But thank you very much.